great Republican small business scam. Small business is a brand name. The shocking truth about which businesses are called small businesses and why. The Chicago Tribune, a quote, small business. Bechtel, small business. A countdown special report, small in name only, with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnston and Chris Hayes.
Final session of Congress before Election Day coming down to the wire now. Democrats are still torn between whether to force Republicans to vote now in defense of tax cuts for the rich or to duck a vote on extending the Bush tax cuts and let Republicans campaign against them for letting all taxes rise. Tax cuts for the rich are simply tax cuts for small businesses whose owners report their business earnings on their individual personal income tax returns. House Democrats have pushed back that some of those supposedly small businesses are actually big businesses, and after the White House identified the right-wing billionaire Koch brothers as being among those ranks, Bill Kristol's right-wing magazine The Weekly Standard fired back, suggesting the White House had improperly looked at the Koch brothers' tax returns. In fact, their tax status was already public information. But as Countdown discovered, with the help of Pulitzer Prize-winning tax reporter David K. Johnston, who joins us presently, the Koch brothers are just the tip of a $500 billion iceberg. A variety of sources, including court documents, confirm that when Republicans talk about the small businesses they're trying to help with their tax cut, they're actually talking about some of the biggest companies in the world and some of the richest people in this country. Mr. Boehner admitting this summer that his tax cuts only benefit 3% of so-called small businesses. So how small can that top 3% be when it accounts for half of all small business income?
Only 3% of those small business people, you keep talking about all the small business people that are going to get taxed, only 3% would be affected by that. Or do you quarrel with that figure? Is that a right figure or a wrong figure?
Well, it may be 3%, but it's half of small business income because obviously the top 3% have half of the gross income for those companies that we would term small businesses.
So how do they decide which companies they would term small businesses? H&R Block told Politico it has 1.5 million small business clients, but extending the Bush tax cuts for the rich would benefit fewer than 0.5% of them. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, fewer than 750,000 people, 0.25% of the country, would be affected by the top rate. So how small can this top 3% of small businesses be if they make half the small business money?
And let's remember the context back then.
Dave Camp knows. He is the ranking Republican member on the House Ways and Means Committee. To him, the definition of small business is a footnote, literally. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 94% of all U.S. businesses in 2007 were S corporations, partnerships, or sole proprietorships, pass-through business types commonly used by small businesses. They call them pass-through companies because they file no taxes, passing through profits to the owners who report them on their individual tax returns instead. In short, they are considered small, not because they have a small payroll, but because they have a small number of owners. It's not the income that's small. It's not the number of employees that's small. It's just the total number of owners that's small. In the case of S-Corps, up to 100 owners.
My colleagues and I have been listening.
When politicians talk about small businesses, they are including any company that pays taxes as a pass-through. House Democrats last week identified 3 limited partnerships that file as pass-throughs: a pipeline company called Enterprise, the Wall Street firm Kohlberg, Kravis & Roberts, and the accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers. The Koch brothers' own website lists partnership after partnership after partnership that make up a small business empire of 70,000 employees. According to the Washington Post, more than 1 million people who reported at least $200,000 in income in 2008 were partnerships and S-corps. The richer you are, the more likely you are to call yourself a small business that way. Boston Globe revealed in 2007 that Fidelity Investments was becoming an S-corp, a move that saved this small business hundreds of millions of dollars. Similar to how a scrappy little newspaper called the Tribune, as in the Chicago Tribune made an extra $1.9 billion by converting to S-Corp status in 2008. As tax reporter David K. Johnston figured out, other companies get revealed as S-Corps when their filings become evidence in tax trials. That's how he identified one of the biggest small businesses in the world. Bechtel, a small business that builds airports, seaports, railroads, oil refineries, nuclear power plants. But back when it was just ye old Bechtel shoppy, they built the Hoover Dam. And today, 49,000 employees, $31 billion in revenue, the world's #1 engineering and construction firm, a small business.
First of all, will we explain what's going on correctly, and can you flesh it out a little bit for us?
Everything you said was correct, and it's actually much worse than this because in addition to being pass-throughs, many of these enterprises benefit from all sorts of tax rules that allow them to take money now and then pay their taxes 10 or 20 years in the future. That's an enormous benefit and a subsidy that ordinary working people who have their taxes taken out of their paycheck before they get it are in effect financing for these businesses. In addition, about 900 of these small corporations, it looks like from the statistics, paid no income taxes even at the personal level of the owner.
When we think about small businesses colloquially, or as we would say, you know, using English, we think of the mom-and-pop hardware store. We think of some online company that's run out of somebody's home. Some employee somewhere is trying to break out on his own and starts his own company selling the proverbial widget. Are any of those kinds of businesses in the range that Republicans are trying to protect in their supposed so-called benefits for so-called small businesses?
Well, Keith, yes, there are some. I mean, you can have an author. Maybe my next book, I'll make enough money to come under your opprobrium for it.
Yep.
There are people who may own a chain of fast food stores or a particularly successful group of liquor stores, but they're a very small portion of this. There are about, as you mentioned, 15,000 S-Corps that have an average revenue of $150 million, and then there's another 18,000 partnerships that have average revenue of about $137 million.
These rich guys, though, paying the top rates, they'd have to pay a lot more in taxes if the Democrats don't renew the top Bush tax cuts, right?
Well, yes and no. They do, after all, have access to tax shelters. There are all sorts of fine rules. The reason the tax code is so thick has nothing to do with ordinary Americans. It has to do with favors bought with campaign donations. But yes, overall, they will pay higher taxes, which will go to provide better infrastructure so they can move their goods and services, educate people so they have people to buy their products, etc.
Just putting aside for a second the Orwellian quality of this whole thing, that peace is war and big business is small business. In terms of hiring, regardless of the size of business, the GOP argument is that raising taxes would curtail new jobs, would curtail hiring. Is that really the biggest factor, or don't businesses wind up deducting those costs in any case from their own taxes and their own expenses?
Well, economic theory says there should be less job creation when we raise taxes. Well, Bill Clinton had Congress raise taxes in 1993, and 8 years later, they were cut, and again 10 years later under President Bush. During Bush's 8 years, 3.5 million jobs were created. During Clinton's years, 6 times as many, 21 million jobs. In fact, during the Clinton years, more jobs were created in those 8 years than in the 20 years of Ronald Reagan and both Bushes in the White House. So I think you have a tough time making that argument. What matters is what the taxes are spent on.
Last question. Is there law or code somewhere that defines what a small business is? Is there actually just a semantical violation here, or is there something more to it?
No, this is essentially semantical. I mean, the SBA says if you have 500 or fewer employees, you're a small business. So certainly by the definition of the Small Business Administration, many of the companies that we've talked about are not small businesses. And remember that small businesses also destroy many jobs. It's a relatively handful of little companies that go on to become big companies. The gazelles, they're known as, like, say, FedEx, that went from nowhere to being a big company very quickly.
David K. Johnston, professor at Syracuse University. Great thanks for your time tonight and for your help. Salon.com reported this week that 91% of the money for Karl Rove's new attack ad group comes from billionaires, 3 billionaires. Countdown has also learned that one of those Rove funding billionaires is, you guessed it, one of those small businesses whose taxes Republicans want to keep at Bush-era levels. He's Carl Lindner, who gave Rove $400,000 last month and who made his $1.7 billion fortune through United Dairy Farmers, a small business with hundreds of stores and one of the top 15 ice cream brands in the country. Number 582 on Forbes' list of the world's billionaires. Not that far below number 463, Henry Hillman, whose family bankrolls Pennsylvania Republicans with proceeds from his small investment business, which Forbes says makes him worth more than $2 billion. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
How does the tax cut debate change now that we know what the Republicans mean by small business and to what degree the public has been had?
Well, you hope the Democrats hammer on this. I mean, what's interesting is that even before this, right, even given the messaging that the Republicans were doing in this completely disingenuous small business chicanery that you revealed, they were still on the wrong side of public opinion. I mean, the fact of the matter is people understand the number 250,000, right? They understand that we are talking about a group of people that's quite small and doing quite well. And when you climb up the income scale, I mean, you start getting up to incomes that are, hedge fund people who are making $1 billion in income in a year. That's a flow. That's not wealth. That's annual income. People understand that. So public opinion was already on the side of progressives on this. The real question is whether the Democrats are going to politically force the issue. I mean, I think something like this, can get rid of whatever last vestiges of resistance there are, but it also exposes the political economy of the way this works and the way that upward redistribution has been sold, not just in this election cycle, but for the last 30 and 40 years.
Incidentally, thank you, Chris, for providing those home movies of your yacht and your champagne. Greg Sargent at Plumline reported that the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, is getting pressure still from the conservocrats, the conservative Democrats, who say that holding on to the middle-class tax cuts, holding the vote, is going to make them vulnerable on Election Day. And a lot of them are pushing to include these GOP tax cuts for the rich as well. The Democratic Congressman Brad Ellsworth of Indiana just said that today, said, get the issue off the table. It'll be much easier for us. How much crazier does that plan now look, now that we know who they'd be helping out by using that plan?
It is so politically, morally, logically bankrupt that it beggars belief. I mean, I wrote a feature for The Nation magazine last year, and I talked about the Blue Dogs, and the big hustle the Blue Dogs have is that they say, our big thing, we're united around one thing, which is deficits. That is the way that they trump themselves. That's their identity as a caucus. And what they are doing here now is to say, we want you to add $700 billion to the deficit over the next 10 years, and then much more in perpetuity, right? Because we're not talking about sunsetting any of this. This is out into the future as far as the eye can see. That's what they're taking a stand on. So it should never be reported. No one should ever say, never let it be said about the Blue Dogs that they care about the deficit. They do not care about the deficit. What they care about is representing the interests of wealthy people that give them lots of money, and or some, or themselves. I don't know. I'm not going to impute to them what their motives are, but what is clear is they don't care about deficits.
We have a draft of this GOP plan that the party, the unsigned one that the party is officially revealing tomorrow. It calls for making the Bush tax cuts permanent for everybody, including, quote, the entrepreneurs and family-owned small businesses on which we depend to create jobs. How does that play now that we know that the families owning these small businesses are worth billions?
And not only are they worth billions, but they are funding this entire enterprise. I mean, that is the thing that's so insidious about what we've seen. I mean, this is part of a larger phenomenon in American political economy. There's a book called Winner Take All Politics. It's by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. Really recommend it to your viewers. And it talks about the way that we've seen this massive rise in inequality over the last 30 years. On the front end, right, before taxes are paid. And then what our government has done is it's come in and it's exacerbated that inequality by cutting taxes for the wealthy. And we've already seen it chipped away. Even when we're talking about Democrats, we're not really talking about a tremendous amount of redistribution that is even on the table, right? This is really at the upper end. And there's already things like the carried interest loophole that allows hedge fund people to pay 15%. That's not even the table. So we're barely even getting at this issue. And the sort of small business story has been one of the most powerful stories that conservatives and the wealthy have used to continue to enrich themselves despite the trends in the economy.